Before you understand recursion, you first have to understand something called the function stack, and that's going to be the focus of this presentation. So if you look at this code, you can see that we have a couple of different methods. At the very top, you have method 2. Immediately below that, you have method 1, but notice that method 2 is called from within method 1. And then if you look below at the very bottom, you can see public static void main string args, and then main has a couple of things that it has to do also. It has to call method 2, and it also has to call method 1. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is to trace through this code so you can see exactly what's happening internally as this program runs. So as always, we start with main because that's the entry point of the program. And note that main has to call method 2 and it also has to call method 1. So what happens here is that we put main on something called a function stack, and you can see that right here. Now again, main has two different things that it has to do. It has to call method 2 and it also has to call method 1, and you can see that right here. So when we call method 2, what's actually going to happen is that we put it on top of the stack and main actually falls asleep. So if you look at method 2 here, there's only one thing that method 2 has to do. It has to print something out to the screen. So as this thing runs, the first thing that's going to print out is method 2 was called. Now method 2 has just finished. So what's going to happen is that we remove method 2 from the stack and then we return back to main. If you notice, I put a comment next to the first thing that main had to do to say that this task has been completed. But the next thing that main has to do is to call method 1. So what do you suppose is going to happen? Well, the same thing is going to happen. So we can come up here and we push method 1 onto the stack, and notice that method 1 has three things that it has to complete before it finishes. So the first thing that it has to do is to print something out to the screen. So we can go ahead and do that. Method 1 was called, now appears as the output at the console, and then we call method 2. So what's going to happen here, you can imagine when we call method 2, it's going to get put on the top of the stack, so both method 1 and main are now asleep. Now just like before, method 2 only has one thing that it has to do, so we go ahead and do that, and method 2 was called, now prints to the screen. Method 2 is now done, so we remove it from the stack, and now we can return back to method 1. So I put a comment here to say that we finished the second thing that method 1 has to do. Now the third thing is just a simple print statement, so we can go ahead and do that. And method 1 is still alive, prints to the screen. And now that method 1 is finished, what do you suppose is going to happen? The same thing. Method 1 gets removed from the stack and we can return back to main to finish this thing out. So this may seem like a trivial example, but it's highly important that you understand how the function stack works before we start to get into some of these more complex recursive functions.